Welcome to the 9th segment of A Journey Through Assyrian History. In the last segment, we talked about the Middle Assyrian period, something that many of us really don't know much about. It's kind of an interesting period, but the sources for it, both archaeological and documentary, are lacking oftentimes. So we're forced to go through various sources found in other regions to find out more about the Middle Assyrian period. But today we're going to talk about a period which is probably the most documented of all in Assyrian history, and the most well known when people discuss the ancient Assyrians, and that is known as the Neo-Assyrian period. The Neo-Assyrian period is supposed to have taken place between circa, not really certain of the number, and this is disputed a little bit by the scholars, but within the range of 913 or 912 BC to 609 BC. We're going to discuss who came to power during this time, but this is roughly the period wherein the Assyrian Empire takes the greatest stage it has ever taken and becomes the greatest empire the world had known. Now, the Assyrian Empire was, of course, known as the very first empire in world history. Empires had come and gone before, but they hadn't established themselves and stabilized themselves in the way the Assyrians had. We've got to remember about 117 to 120 kings are contained in the Assyrian kings list. Now, some dispute the authenticity or the historical accuracy of the very early kings. But by and large, this source, which was copied over and over again by the ancient Assyrians, and which gave them a sense of pride of identity and continuity in history, is considered by many scholars to be a very reliable source to know about history. And when tested with other written sources, such as Hittite or Egyptian, we come out with the conclusion that this is a very good source to follow in terms of a timeline. So what begins the Neo-Assyrian period? It begins with King Adad-nirari in 912 BC to 891 BC, where the empire makes great territorial expansions and eventually controls the entire region of Mesopotamia, parts of Anatolia, the Levant, and eventually Egypt, and other parts of North Africa. The Assyrians had the most effective fighting force in the world. But this was not all. Their administration was key. It was not enough to win battles or wars. That is not how Assyria would become great. The key was to rule effectively and to administer the conquered or annexed territories with sophistication, with care, and with diplomacy, using force in a very limited way, which is what happened. Of course, the tactics of the army, its organization, its weapons, and so on, made it invincible. No power could compete with Assyria. The kings of the empire, for example, Tiglath-Pileser III, Shalmaneser V, Sargon II, Sennacherib, Sarhaddon, and the last and the greatest of the Assyrian kings, Ashurbanipal, were known and became emperors throughout the ancient Near East. And they were known for not simply conquering territories, but for building cities and architectural wonders and for achieving artistic wonders. For example, Sennacherib's aqueduct is considered one of the wonders of the world. His hanging gardens in Nineveh, not in Babylon, because previously we had thought the hanging gardens were in Babylon, but Sennacherib built his hanging gardens in Nineveh, according to, in particular, one scholar, Miss Stephanie Daly of Oxford. It was built in Nineveh, and it made sense because he referred to it throughout his sources, and we even have drawings and sketches and reliefs attesting to the fact that these gardens were most likely in the city of Nineveh. The library of Ashurbanipal, the great cities of Ashur and Nineveh and Kelhu and Erbil and so many other cities were a testament to the longevity and the stability of the Assyrian Empire. And this is what these kings did. They didn't simply follow one another by expanding their rule. They followed one another by expanding their dominance through culture, the arts, the laws, and through diplomacy. Now, Neo-Assyrian is a designation coined by modern scholars based on the interpretations of the inscriptions of these kings, all of whom are documented through artistic and literary expressions. And the Neo-Assyrian period is supposed to represent a major change in the way the Assyrian Empire was ruled. So this period is another marker for the growth of the Assyrian Empire. The date of this beginning of this period is sometimes contested, but it claims to begin when a new assertiveness in the political turmoil associated with the Aramaean invasion of the 12th and 11th centuries BC takes place. Others maintain that this period really begins with the rule of Adad-nirari II, as we said, in 912 BC. There are even scholars who claim that the real beginning of the Neo-Assyrian period is really with Tiglat-Pileser III in 745 BC. He is, of course, the father of Sargon II. And, of course, Sargon II, his son Sennacherib, his son Sarhaddon, and his son Ashurbanipal are known as the Sargonid kings. They're the last great kings of Assyria, of ancient Assyria. Now, the same situation holds that some scholars cite the end of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in 612 BC, and others hold, as I do, in 609 BC with the fall of the city of Haran, when Ashur-uballit II was no longer able to maintain an offensive and a defensive military position against the enemies of Assyria. At that time, the king of Babylon and the Medes and the Scythians. Now, the Assyrians had, during this time in particular, had been known as cruel and barbaric because of their military activities. And this is the period that most people are familiar with when they discuss the Assyrian cruelty. And these are the kings that appear in the Bible, some of whom I've listed, such as, in particular, Sennacherib. According to one author, quote, Assyria must surely have among the worst press in any state in history. Babylon may be a byname for corruption, decadence, and sin, but the Assyrians and their famous rulers, with terrifying names like Shalmaneser, Tiglat-Pileser, Sennacherib, Sarhaddon, and Ashurbanipal, rate in the popular imagination just below Adolf Hitler and Genghis Khan for cruelty, violence, and sheer murderous savagery, end of quote. But no such thing is justifiable. There was no concept of a master race in Assyrian policies. Everyone was considered an asset to the empire, whether they were born Assyrian or were assimilated into the culture. And certainly, from the Middle Assyrian period to the beginning of the Neo-Assyrian period, many people were assimilated into what came to be known as Assyria. For example, the Aramaean tribes that the Assyrians discussed. One king discusses, for example, crossing the Euphrates on multiple occasions to quell the various rebellions and the chaos that was taking place. The Aramaean states eventually, and the Aramaean tribes were forced into the Assyrian realm and became assimilated into Assyrian culture and adopted the Assyrian identity. So that by the fall of the Assyrian Empire in 609 BC, the Assyrians didn't have to contend with, for example, a rising population of Aramaeans. This we never hear of. The Assyrian state simply collapsed, and within it were people who were previously considered Aramaeans or Mitannis and others. All had come together to be known as Assyrians throughout history. Now, in truth, Assyrian warfare was no more savage than other contemporary states. Indeed, the Assyrians were not any more cruel than, say, the Romans, or the Parthians, or the Persians, or any other people. Don't forget, it was the Romans who were crucifying people up until the time of Christ, and even past that time, not the Assyrians. And it was the British who were hanging heads of various people declared enemies of state, or simply having committed crimes, hanging their heads in the London Tower, up until the very recent times. The massive armies of the Assyrians, when we talk about the beginning of the Neo-Assyrian period, lay into the future. The rise of Adad-nirari, as we said, marked the beginning of the Neo-Assyrian period, brought the kind of revival Assyria needed at the time. Remember, we're going from the Middle Assyrian period, which ended about 1000 BC, into now the Neo-Assyrian period beginning less than 100 years later. This is when the Assyrians, this brief period between the Middle and the Neo-Assyrian period, when Assyria is considered to have suffered a slight decline. And this was coming at the end of the collapse of the Bronze Age. The Assyrians had lost territory from various peoples, and there were invasions of various marauding tribes and so on the Euphrates and to the west of the Tigris. But Adad-nirari II reclaimed many territories that were lost and re-strengthened Assyria. He also conquered Babylon. But he had learned from the mistakes of the past when Tukulti-Ninurta sacked Babylon in 1225 BC and was later assassinated. Adad-nirari was able to solidify his rule and to provide stability in the area for centuries to come. The kings that followed Adad-nirari continued with the same policies. So what we have here is stability and consistency in rule. The Assyrian kings emphasized diplomacy rather than military activity. Military activity, as some historians have said since that time, was basically diplomacy by other means. When no other option was found, it was necessary to go to war. Now, the Assyrian kings would rather prevent it, but once involved, took a lot of pride in what they could achieve in battles and in war. And the empire expanded its territory towards the southern Anatolia. Then, after Adad-nirari, Ashurbanipal II came, 884 BC to 859 BC. This was the king that transferred the capital of Assyria for the very first time from the sacred city, the holy city of Ashur, to the city of Kalhu, which was newly built on a site that was much older. And so this move represented a major departure from the rule within Ashur. The reason is because the families that were, according to many historians, predominant in Assyrian affairs were now living somewhere else. The king had separated himself and was now in charge of an empire from a very new capital, the capital of Kalhu, also known as Nimrud. Now, more than anything else, the Assyrian armies had excelled at siege warfare and was probably the first force in the world to carry out separate corps of engineers. Assault was their principal tactic against heavily fortified cities of the ancient Near East. And we have to know this was a period when a lot of cities had been built in the Near East. And so to take them, the standard warfare of the past had changed. Now, new technology was necessary, and the Assyrian army was the first to develop this sort of technology. They developed a great method and a variety of methods for breaching enemy walls. Sappers were employed to undermine the walls of cities and light fires beneath them, to destroy wooden gates, and ramps were created to be able to launch armies into the cities themselves, where it was most vulnerable. Mobile ladders allowed attackers to cross moats, which provided the city with protection, and land into the city itself. These operations were covered by masses of archers who were the core of the infantry. But by the pride of the Assyrian siege train were their engineers. These were incredible people who were talented and trained in the special art of warfare. And they led these incredible wooden siege engines across the landscape to face the cities and to bring them down. Any city that resisted Assyrian power was in danger of being completely destroyed. And cities across the Near East soon learned that resisting Assyrian power, when it came time to paying tribute or being part of the order of the Assyrian Empire, Pax Assyriana, if you will, was a useless task, was a hopeless endeavor. Now, advancements in military technology were not the only, or even the primary, contribution of the Assyrians during this time, during the Neo-Assyrian period. The Assyrians made incredible progress in medicine, building on the foundations of earlier civilizations, even Sumerians, and drawing the knowledge and talents of the conquered and assimilated peoples. Ashurbanipal made the first systematic list of plants and animals in the empire and brought scribes with him on the campaign wherever he went to make new finds. Schools were established throughout the empire, but they were limited in scope because they taught only the sons and daughters of the wealthy nobility. This was a prelude for the creation of greater schools in the future, when Assyrians created the school of Nisibin, for example, the very first university in the world. Now, women were not allowed to attend or hold positions of authority in the Assyrian Empire, even though they enjoyed equal rights. The decline of women's rights correlates with the growth of the Assyrian Empire. As the Assyrian armies campaigned throughout the world, their god Ashur went with them. But as Ashur was previously linked with the holy site of the temple within the city of Ashur, his worship across the empire had to be a little bit different. Now, the development of so many areas within the Assyrian Empire that transformed the state of Assyria into something called the Neo-Assyrian period really changed the landscape of not only the state of Assyria, but the entire Near East. And one could say that many states weren't simply under the domination of the Assyrian Empire, but also benefited from the greater expansion of the Assyrian state. For example, the Philistines on the coast of the Mediterranean, near the border of Egypt, profited from the Assyrians who supported them in their creation of various factories producing olive oil. Hundreds of such places were found, and in these places, the Philistines were able to manufacture olive oil that was shipped to the rest of the Mediterranean from the east to the west, such as the Near East had never seen before, and to be beneficial not only to the ruled, but to the ruled. The Assyrians created libraries all across the Near East, especially in the Assyrian heartland, kept archives, and recorded events such as never been recorded before, peace treaties, trade developments, created trading centers all over the Near East, including in Egypt, and basically created what we came to know as the entire Middle East today. And when the Assyrian Empire fell, the tragedy was not only for the Assyrian heartland. The tragedy of the fall of the Assyrian cities, the great Assyrian cities of Ashur and Nineveh and Nimrud, shook the entire known world and prompted the Egyptians to send their armies out to protect the order that had been established by the Assyrians. In the next presentation, we will talk about the fall of Assyria and how that transformed the world and how it also transformed the Assyrians. Join us next time for the 10th episode of A Journey Through Assyrian History.